They weren't just wild men with axes, they were the storm before the empire fell. Histox is here to bring history to life with epic tales and unforgettable moments. Let's roll into the rest of the story. In the late 19th century, Korea found itself at the heart of a tense power struggle between neighboring empires. Both Qing China and Meiji Japan viewed control of the Korean peninsula as essential to their national security and prestige. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, their competition over Korean influence would escalate into a full-scale war, shaped by internal strife in Korea and the wider ambitions of these rising and declining powers. In 1885, the fragile balance of power in East Asia became even more strained when Britain briefly occupied a Korean port amid its rivalry with Russia in Central Asia, known as the Great Game. Meanwhile, Russia advanced its ambitions in the region by constructing the Trans-Siberian Railway and securing rights over territories in Manchuria. Korea itself was in crisis. Power struggles racked the Joseon court, particularly between King Gyeongjong, his father the Daewongun, and Queen Min. Reformers looked to Japan as a model for modernization, while conservatives remained loyal to Confucian ties with China. The Korean populace, burdened by corruption and hardship, erupted in repeated uprisings. By the early 1890s, a growing religious and social movement, the Tonghaks, began challenging the state. Their syncretic teachings in opposition to foreign influence and state corruption attracted many followers. When the Tonghaks revolted in early 1894, the Korean government requested help from China. Chinese troops landed in Korea, but their deployment was not coordinated with Japan, violating an 1885 agreement. Japan responded by sending its own troops, sparking a confrontation. Though the rebellion was quickly suppressed, tensions had reached a boiling point. Japan refused to withdraw, citing the need for reform in Korea. Diplomatic efforts failed, and in July 1894, Japanese forces staged a coup in Seoul, deposing the Queen's faction and installing a pro-Japanese government. Days later, Japanese ships attacked Chinese vessels off the coast, and on August 1st, war was declared. Japan's military was smaller, but better organized and modernized. In contrast, China's regional armies were poorly coordinated and outdated despite some efforts at reform. The Japanese seized the initiative, winning swift victories at Songwon and Pyongyang. At Pyongyang, Japanese forces used clever tactics to outmaneuver Chinese defenders and captured the city within 2 days. China still held naval superiority in theory, thanks to its Beiyang fleet, but poor coordination doomed it. At the Battle of the Yalu River, miscommunication and disorder in the Chinese command allowed the Japanese fleet to strike a decisive blow, crippling China's naval strength. Emboldened, Japan launched invasions into Chinese territory. The One Stone Army advanced into Manchuria, while the Second Army captured the strategic port of Port Arthur. There, after an initial victory, Japanese troops committed a massacre of civilians, driven by rumors of guerrilla attacks and vengeance. Though Tokyo denied the atrocities, foreign observers and reports tarnished Japan's image abroad. Back in Korea, Japan's influence deepened. Although it had claimed to support Korean independence, in reality, it sought control. After discovering a plot by the Daewongun to oust Japanese allies and seek aid from China and Russia, Japanese forces removed him from power. This action, coupled with ongoing abuses, reignited the Tonghak Rebellion in October. Despite their large numbers, the poorly armed rebels stood little chance against modern Japanese and Korean government troops. By January 1895, the revolt had been crushed. Meanwhile, in China, political instability grew. The Qing court faced internal divisions, and after repeated military defeats, the influential Viceroy Li Hongzhang sought peace. Peace negotiations were soon underway, marking the final chapter of the war. In early 1895, with Japanese forces continuing their advance and China in no position to retaliate, both sides agreed to negotiate peace. The talks took place in the Japanese city of Shimonoseki. Representing the Qing Empire was Viceroy Li Hongzhang, while Japan was represented by Foreign Minister Mutsu Munemitsu and Prime Minister Ito Hirobumi. The negotiations were tense. During the talks, a Japanese fanatic attempted to assassinate Li Hongzhang, shooting him in the face. Ironically, the attack worked in China's favor, slightly softening Japan's demands. Still, the final terms of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, signed in April 1895, were harsh and marked a historic turning point in East Asia. Under the treaty, China was forced to recognize Korea as an independent state, effectively ending centuries of Korean vassalage to the Qing Empire and opening the way for Japanese dominance. China also ceded Taiwan, the Pescadores Islands, and the Liaodong Peninsula to Japan, along with a massive indemnity and trading privileges. Japan emerged as a new imperial power, having defeated a major continental empire for the first time in modern East Asian history. The victory stunned Western observers and reshaped perceptions of Japan globally. However, Japan's triumph also drew the attention and ire of the other imperial powers. Just days after the treaty was signed, Russia, France, and Germany intervened in what became known as the Triple Intervention. They demanded that Japan return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, arguing that its control threatened peace in the region. Lacking the naval power to resist, Japan reluctantly complied, though the move sparked deep resentment among Japanese nationalists. Many viewed the intervention as a humiliating betrayal by the West, after Japan had proven itself militarily and diplomatically. This resentment would fester for decades and fuel Japan's growing sense of grievance and ambition. Meanwhile, Russia quickly took over the very territory it had insisted Japan give back, leasing Port Arthur and building a naval base there, further stoking tensions that would later explode in the Russo-Japanese War. For China, the war was a catastrophe. It exposed the failure of the Qing reform efforts and accelerated the empire's decline. Public outrage over defeat and humiliation intensified domestic instability, leading to calls for modernization and, eventually, revolution. Korea, now declared independent, quickly fell under Japanese domination. Queen Min, who had sought Russian support to counter Japanese influence, was brutally assassinated by Japanese agents later that year. King Gorong fled to the Russian legation in Seoul for safety. In the years that followed, Korea would become increasingly subjugated, culminating in full annexation by Japan in 1910. This conflict marked the rise of Japan as a modern imperial power, the beginning of the end for the Qing Dynasty, and the first sparks of major 20th century conflicts in East Asia. It was more than a regional war. It was a reshuffling of power in a changing world. After the war, Japan had emerged as a new power in East Asia. The victory over Qing China sent shockwaves through the global political order. An Asian country had defeated another for the first time in modern history, using Western-style military reforms. But the war's aftermath was far from peaceful. The Triple Intervention by Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to return the Liaodong Peninsula to China, despite it being ceded in the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Japan, feeling humiliated. But the war didn't end with a treaty. It left behind a broken court, a queen's blood on palace stones, and a king hiding behind Russian walls. Korea was no longer master of its fate. The pieces were still moving. And the empire? So, was that what you expected from ancient warriors? Hit like, smash subscribe, and let's dive deeper into history's wildest tales.